All right, welcome back, Keeping It Rural listeners. I'm not the voice you're expecting to hear, but I'm the one you're getting today. This is producer Loren King on my first ever episode. You might have heard me in one other episode before this where I added a little bit of context information, but this time I've got the whole shebang and I'm hanging out here with somebody I get to know pretty well, Mr. Allan Robinette. Allan, I'm going to kick it right off with our first question. Introduce us to your operation, sir. What is it that you guys do?
Yes, thank you, Lauren. So I'm a manager at Robinette's Apple House and Winery in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're a fruit farm. We grow apples, peaches, and cherries, and we do everything direct to consumer. Our operations centered around agritourism and retail marketing. We have corn maze, we have winery, we have bakery, cider mill, everything that we can to sell products directly to the customer for as much of the year as possible. We are open year round, and we do everything we can to have as much fruit for as much of the year as we can. And when we don't have fruit, we have donuts.
Fantastic. I'm still planning on getting out there. I told Emily, she said, this is the year we're going to make it. We just had that conversation like a few days ago. There's a few questions that came to mind just based off of what you said. But first off, I do want to hear a little bit about your family history and what led you guys there. I mean, did you start with the apple farm? What was the background?
So I come from, like most farmers, I come from a long line of farmers back, through recorded history. But at Robinette's, we started in 1911, and that was when my great grandfather purchased the farm at 65 in 1911, which was
Really?
about the mortality, or,
No
about
kidding.
that wasn't the retirement age in 1911. That was the age you might die in 1911. So
Mhm.
I've always wondered what was going through his mind. He was a farmer down in Bedford, Ohio. And in 1911, he visited a friend up in Grand Rapids and saw there was a peach farm for sale. And he came up and bought it. He moved everything up. And interestingly enough, my great grandfather was out threshing wheat out west. That was where the work was. And when he came home, home wasn't in Ohio anymore. So I'd love to know how that conversation went with, coming back home and talking to the neighbors and saying, "Oh yeah, your dad's up in Michigan." I don't know if they ever got word to him. I think he was working wherever the work was. So I don't think he found out till he got back to Ohio. That would be an interesting shift.
As a side note, do you have any like diaries or records from that age, or have you looked at Ancestry to see if there's like, tidbits to learn a little bit more about that?
No, most of what we have is just passed down stories. So there's a lot of, I don't think we have any diaries. We've kept really good track of our genealogy and ancestry, but so we know that we trace our family history back to the first Robinette was named Allan Robinette, and he came over with William Penn in the 1600s and bought land in Pennsylvania. So that's where we trace things. They were Huguenots, they were fleeing religious persecution to come, not the United States yet, but to come to the colonies. And so that was where we trace our lineage. There's a connection with France before then, but we don't have a firm link to that.
I'm going to divert from our questions a little bit and ask about peaches because a lot of people might not know that peach production is like a thing that you can do in Michigan. So if you want to briefly touch on that and kind of touch on how you're able to do it in the state.
Yeah, Michigan has a great climate for peaches. In fact, I believe we grow better peaches than Georgia does because Georgia's just so hot. We have this lake effect weather that really helps shield us from excessive heat, and it helps us from being too cold. So quite often across like Michigan and Wisconsin, they can't really grow peaches because they get too cold in the winter. So peach trees aren't quite as cold hardy. They like, warmer winters and above zero, meaning warm. But yeah, our farm was entirely peaches back when it was purchased because peaches were huge money. So we've got a big farmhouse on the farm, and I never really understood how big that house was until I lived in it while my house was being built. And I asked my dad, how did the Brayman family, who we bought the farm from, afford to build such a large house? And he said, peaches. And I said, okay, but we grow peaches. And he said, no, you don't understand. Back in the 1880s, they were selling peaches for $3 a bushel wholesale, which in 2019 money adjusted for inflation is like $90 a bushel wholesale. So they'd ship them down to Chicago, and there was big money in peaches. And of course, that all ended when the refrigerated boxcar was invented. After that, you could ship peaches anywhere. So before then, you needed to be relatively close to where the peaches were grown. And that's why they were such a big money item. We've since diversified. We still grow peaches, but we only grow 2 acres. Now, we've only got 15 acres of apples. So it's not like it's a minuscule amount compared to what else we grow, but it's certainly not our main crop anymore.
That is super cool. I confess that I only realized you did apples. Back on track, back on track. So, what's your current role on the farm and what led you to that?
So I would call myself an operating manager. I do a little bit of everything, cleaning the toilets to picking the fruit. We have not, I do wash my between that, but we're a relatively small farm compared to most other fruit operations. So I don't have a lot of laborers. A lot of my help is seasonal, local help, high school and college students. So a lot of the year, a lot of the agricultural labor is done by me and my dad and my two uncles. I do have one other full-time employee, but for the most part, it's just us. So I'm out there right now trimming all the trees. We're doing dormant pruning. Come, summer, I'll be picking cherries and then picking peaches and then picking apples after that. I do a lot of the picking.
What's the best fruit for you guys to pick? Which one are you just like, oh, this is a breeze compared to the others, or are they all kind of similar?
I would say sweet cherries is one of the easiest because of how fast it gets done. Now, a lot of ours is U-Pick. That started back in World War II. My great
Oh,
grandfather didn't have any labor. All the young men were overseas fighting the Germans and the Japanese. So we had a shortage of labor. And my great grandfather said, okay, let's do U-Pick. That's how we've done it ever since. That's primarily how we do it with cherries. So we pick some for sale, by the quart and by the pound, but for the most part, it's done by customers who come to pick directly. So I would say that's the easiest, and especially it's just so fast and it's easy to reach, especially with the way we grow cherries now. It's a breeze.
awesome. I don't think I've had a chance to pick cherries before. I kind of want to now. You pick with you guys, give you some free
Yeah,
labor.
it's way easier than blueberries or anything low
Oh,
like
blueberries. Oh my
strawberries.
gosh. Yeah, I've got horror stories from when I was a child, but that's not for today's episode. All right, getting back on track once again because it's so much fun to get off and learn about these fruits. But when you were like a kid, did you have an inkling that this is what you wanted to do? Were you looking other areas? What led you into ag?
I started working on the farm at a very young age. That was how I got my allowance. My income was my
Same. Yeah. Yeah.
allowance. Yeah, I know you know about how that goes, but yeah, my parents never pressured me and said, this is what you must do. All my family was in it, but they said, pursue what you want to pursue. I worked on the farm full time. Once I left high school, I attended college briefly while I was trying to figure out if I wanted to do anything else. I briefly considered architecture, but I was very bad at architecture. So I decided not to do that. And one day, just kind of, there was never an aha moment. I just realized one day, hey, I'm already doing what I want to do. And so it really comes from, exposure to the job. And I learned a lot about the job on the job. And here I am today.
Here you are. It seems like you made the right decision. So I know we already touched on a little bit of what you're doing as an operations manager, but in a typical week, do you have a structure or schedule, or is it more of things arise and you deal with them in the moment?
I'd say primarily for most of the year, it's as they arrive. I'll see quite often what we're going to do today is this. And then, oh, nope, we're going to fix the tools, need to do that task.
We got a flat, so we got to go deal with
Yeah.
that. And yeah.
So there's a lot of that. There is a good cycle to my job in the year right now. As I said, I'm pruning fruit trees, and so I prune the fruit trees, and then in the spring we start training our trees. Whether it's thinning, we'll quite often thin our peaches in the early summer, and we'll train up apple trees, make sure they're growing right, and then starting July we'll be picking cherries. Then we're picking peaches come August. Then we're picking apples come September, and then our busy season starts. We get through, our busy season, and then we get into November. We sell a lot of pies for Thanksgiving. And then come December, we're shipping a lot of gift boxes with it. We have a lot of Apple gift boxes that we send all over the country. And then we're back to pruning. So there's this, even though there's unpredictability from day to day, there's a core schedule that I have of this cycle during the year that it's quite comforting to me. I kind of know what I'm going to do based on what time of year.
Yeah, that helps. All right. So we touched on, how things change seasonally, and that's pretty cool. And maybe we'll have to have you back to go more into more fruit production because I've had a lot of questions there. But the meat and potatoes of this episode I want to get into is innovation and communication and how you approach both on your farm. I've gotten to hear a little bit about things. I mean, even the idea of gift boxes for apples is, I would say, probably innovative in a lot of senses when it comes to fruit. So, how do you guys approach new ideas on the farm? You've incorporated a lot on the farm or just in the business as a whole.
I would say new ideas are what keeps us afloat. We're a really small farm, but we're right outside of a large growing area in Grand Rapids. And so if we hadn't switched from wholesale to retail back in the early 70s, we wouldn't exist anymore. Adding a cider mill, that was an idea that my grandfather got from visiting other farms. And he saw, what are they doing to stay afloat? Because if we don't change, we're going to go out of business. And so that's a lot of where the change comes from is, what do we have to do to stay relevant? So when it came to adding a cider mill, and then we've added a bakery, and then we added, back in 2006, we added a winery. And then in 2009, we added a corn maze. So really leaning into that agritourism style of business, that was really what kept us relevant. So a lot of the changes are from necessity. Some of it's from trying to have an idea of what would be good for our business. I'm always trying to think of the next best thing. We're always thinking of new apple varieties to plant. You pick is big. I'm trying to plant popular varieties right now, things that are eye catching and will bring people here.
Awesome. Yeah, that's pretty clear, even just from what I've heard, and today reinforces it. But would you say that's a function of working in specialty crops more, or a function of your location? Are they all contributors to why you guys keep a constant innovation movement going?
It's both. Apples, particularly, there's always a new variety that people want to try. Of course, Honeycrisp is still king, but
Of
we
course.
have new varieties such as Ludicrisp, and that one's a very popular one just based on the name, but it has a taste similar to juicy fruit gum. So that one's
Oh,
really interesting. And, so there's always new varieties with apples. There's always varieties that people don't really care about anymore. I have probably 100 or 200 Golden Delicious trees in my U pick section that people just don't really touch. And it's a
hmm.
great apple, especially right off the tree.
Yeah.
But I can't really force people to have that. So that forces some innovation. Okay, let's find a new variety to plant. Let's see what's new. And so we're always trying something new and always changing what we're doing.
I've heard that from the Apple side as things come forward, like Cosmic Crisp and other varieties that are proposed. But I do think that if you guys don't get Ludicrous out there for the Ludicrous promotion, it's a real missed opportunity. Get that big guy.
We hit him up on Instagram and he didn't respond. So we're gonna keep
Ah,
trying.
if I ever run into him on the street, I'll let you know. I know you talked about being close to Grand Rapids, which is probably one of the more unique things about your farm compared to others I've talked to, just because you're so close to a large residential area. With that, how have you had to modify your approach to kind of deal with that consumer body being so close?
It's really parking. We've taken out a lot of fruit trees for parking, and
Hmm.
it's parking we only use 4 weeks of the year. I mean, 6 weeks of the year is really our busy season, but 4 weeks is when we really utilize it. And so it hurts to do that. When to say, okay, we had some full size cherry trees, like 20-foot tall cherry trees that
Hmm.
they were starting to see some wear injury and they were over 40 years old. And but they needed to be replaced. They were too big and they were taking up a lot of room, and we were able to grow cherries more efficient. That hurt a little bit. I grew up climbing those trees, picking those trees, and it hurt to do that. But we could fit 2 rows of cars where that 1 row of tree was. So you have to weigh that and say, okay, we have to sacrifice some land here. So now I've got a big open grass field that we park cars in for 4 weeks of the year, but otherwise it doesn't really get used. Apart from that, I would say space is at a premium. We're always trying to cram more trees into our very high density apple orchard because we've only got 30 acres that we can really use out of the hundred and some that we have. A lot of it's swamp and forest, and we can't expand. I know this is a Keeping It Rural podcast, and that's what we're trying to do. But I call myself a suburban farmer. We've got a state highway on one side, we've got houses on the other, we've got a school to the north and a college to the south. So we're pretty locked in. And there's no expanding, there's no buying up the neighboring farm because those all sold 40 years ago.
Yeah, you're working on density, like you talked about with the trees, but even I'm sure with the winery and the bakery as well, and just fitting more into that space. Yeah, we think of keeping it rural is more of a mindset too. So no
Yeah.
worries there. You definitely qualify with that. You've got to communicate with, like, I'm sure, very diverse people. We've talked about that before, but how do you do that? I mean, how do you approach it when somebody's more interested in organic, or if they're not coming from an ag background, young, old, different cultures? Do you have ways that you approach communication?
Yeah, we get a lot of questions. I don't often do it proactively, but
Mhm.
you get a lot of questions as a retailer, people saying, "Hey, are these apples organic?" And I'm not an organic grower. It's really hard to do that in Michigan with apples. We have
Mhm.
a lot of moisture, and I'm sure you're very aware that moisture is very difficult to deal with being an organic grower. There's tremendous opportunity there as a retailer. I talk with customers all the time who ask questions about their food, and I'm lucky enough to be there to answer them. That's one of my favorite things about the job is that people come with questions and they say, "Hey, look, I don't know about my food. I don't know if this is what I want. And
Mhm.
especially, the organic question. And so one of my favorite things to talk about is, hey, I'm not an organic grower, but I do have some organic practices. And I talk to them about, for example, mating disruption for codling moths. So we set out pheromone disruptors that prevents the codling moth from finding each other and they don't sting our fruit and lay eggs in it. So it's little things like that really fascinate people. And quite
Yeah.
often they end the conversation, I'm worried about your fruit. And then they end the conversation saying, wow, I didn't know that. That's crazy. And then they have a bag of apples in their arm and they're smiling as they walk away. That opportunity to really show someone, hey, there's a lot more
Mhm.
here than you initially understand. And, it's not evil that I'm a conventional farm.
Yeah, and maybe this isn't truly accurate, but from what I'm seeing, that's almost where the conversation with regenerative farming is going to some extent, is that it's a lot more, this is my location, these are the practices my location requires. We're not trying to overuse resources or damage resources, but sometimes it requires this, sometimes it requires that. Maybe it's just because it's such a nascent term and people aren't necessarily used to defining it in the same way they are organic or sustainability, but I do see more conversation online around like, hey, this apple orchard over here is going to look different. The practices are going to look different just because of where it is. You're in more swampy ground, you've got a lot of moisture. Somebody out in another state or in a drier climate might have to do something completely different, but that doesn't mean they're bad. That's for sure. So it's awesome. I mean, honestly, you're doing more work probably for consumer awareness than any single social media post has ever done in its life. So, do you have any success stories that come to mind when you think about that communication? Was there any specific moment where you're like, yes, I got them, that worked? They understood.
I would say really keep coming back to that organic question. And there's several I can think of where, people come in and they say they don't have organic fruit. I don't want to buy it. And I can kind of change their mind. And it's not that organic fruit is bad, but
Mhm,
I just can't grow it where I live.
mhm,
And so to be able to tell these people, initially they're like, I don't know about this, but they don't necessarily know what organic means.
mhm.
So it really, there's a lot of stories with that opportunity, where I can tell somebody about like, these are the practices I use. And they just think, oh, they just spray poison all over their fruit. No,
Yeah.
that's not true. And so it's great to have the ability to tell them that. If I
Mhm.
sent my fruit to a grocery store, I would have no connection with the customer. And they
Yeah.
might look at it and say, it's not organic. I don't want it. There's a lot of situations, a lot of stories where I've had people come in, whether it's peaches or apples, and I can say, hey, these are safe product. I eat them myself. I eat them right off the tree. There's a lot of opportunities. We've had a retail market for so long. I see customers that we've had for longer than I've been alive, and they've brought their children, and now the grandkids are coming along too. And so there's that long-standing history we have with these customers that keep coming back.
That's awesome. That's a cool history to have built in. So we were talking before the episode started that you've had some pretty big and amazing guests that have come before. What's that like? That's got to disrupt the farm to some degree. What's your process when you're hosting a celebrity or a news organization?
That was an interesting thing. We're very close to the airport in Grand Rapids. So we had the Secretary of Agriculture under Donald Trump, Sonny Perdue. He came to our farm to announce farmers.gov, his new website that he was in charge of. It's a lot of spur of the moment stuff. You don't always know what's coming. We had Ivanka Trump stop by our farm. That was an interesting visit. And there was some controversy there because, we had to fight some perception. People are saying, what's she doing campaigning at your farm? I said, she's not running for anything. And she was there to buy donuts and cider for her staff. So it wasn't campaign stop. She did stop at another farm in Michigan for a campaign stop, but our
Mm,
stop was just a shopping trip. And so we had some negative reaction to that. And, people saying, why would you allow her to come to your farm? Why would you allow this? I don't stop people from coming to my farm based on who they are.
mm.
A lot of it's just spur of the moment. I had some heads up that she was coming. They just wanted to say, hey, this might be a little crazy, but are you okay with her coming? That was a member of her staff. Yeah, sure. We had the administrator of the EPA, Andrew Wheeler. So that was a great visit, a very informal visit. That was probably the least formal visit I had. He was just stopping at a farm and we were talking about our practices. And I was able to tell him about the meat program in Michigan, the Michigan
Environmental
Agricultural
assurance program.
Environmental Assurance
I know
Program. Yeah.
there's too many A's.
That first A is what always throws me off. But yeah,
Yep.
so he at the national level didn't know about that, what we were doing in Michigan to be stewards of our environment. And, that we hold ourselves to higher standards than what is required by law. So that was a great opportunity, but that ended with him saying, oh, you have Blue Moon ice cream? I love Blue Moon ice cream. And so I have a great picture somewhere of he and my dad sitting on the swing in front of the business eating ice cream together. And I said, this man leads a very powerful agency in Washington. Here we are eating ice cream. That was a great visit.
We're all humans, right? Speaking as a Blue Moon ice cream lover myself, personally, it's the only thing I'd eat for like 10 years growing up. Only ice cream I'd eat. I'd eat other foods. You touched on something really interesting, and I didn't have it written down, but the meat program for Michigan is a really cool idea that some states are copying now. You want to give just like a brief outline of what that is for folks who might not have heard of it?
Yeah. So the meat program in Michigan, and that's again, I'll do it without butchering it this time, Michigan Agricultural Environmental Assurance Program. That was passed into law, I believe, back in 2013 or around that. It's a program funded by fees on chemical purchases. So if someone purchases herbicide, it's funded on fees tacked onto that. So it's not paid for with taxpayer dollars. It's not paid for with public money, but it is funded. And what that is basically we have meat technicians based on our part of the state that work with us to say, hey, look, this is what you could do to follow the best practices and say that you are environmentally verified. So everyone who is meat verified has a sign on their farm that you can put right next to the road that says this farm is environmentally verified. And especially with a retail farm, that's great to point to and say, look at all we're doing for the environment. We care about it just as much as you do. In fact, we make our living off of it. So we don't want to damage it. It was really easy as a fruit farm to become meat verified because a lot of the practices that we might be looking at to say become meat verified are we're already doing. Especially with fruit farms, we have perennial ground cover. We're not tilling up our land a lot, so there's not a lot of erosion. Between our trees, there's grass. For row crops, it might be buffer strips. And really the only change I had to make to become meat verified was putting a cement pad under my spray tank. So where we fill our sprayer, that was the only change that we had to make. And that was a nice change anyway. It's something we would have wanted to do anyway. So it was really not a big change for us. Some people, when it comes to like row crops, it's just, erosion control. And like I said, a lot of farmers are already doing these practices anyway, because if you don't take care of the land that you're getting your income from, you're not going to be doing it for much longer.
Yeah, and for listeners, the meat program is highly respected in our state. We really value it a lot. It solved a lot of issues. It provides some fantastic support for farms from a legal perspective, but more than that, like you said, it's a great opportunity for consumers to see that, hey, this farm is putting in the work. And they probably were putting in the work already. Now they just have a sign that shows that they were doing it for sure. All right, so I want to talk about community involvement and local politics. This is something that you and I have bonded over. We connected through a Farm Bureau program that largely focused on this, the Political Leadership Academy. So can you talk a little bit about your interest in it and then representing a farm when it comes to that? I'm sure it's very interesting being so close to Grand Rapids.
Yeah. So my family history is my dad serves on our township currently as our clerk.
Mhm.
And before that, he was the trustee. And my grandfather was a township trustee and my great grandfather was a township trustee. And so there's this instilled belief in me that really, if you want to have a say in how things are done where you live, you should be involved in local government. So that's really something I'm passionate about. I'm going to pursue that once my dad's no longer on the board. It's something I've been looking at planning commission and board of review for my township lately, but no openings just now. But that's my goal because I want to have a say in how things are done where I live. There's a lot of discussion in the state of Michigan. We really need farmers in government and state legislature. And I wholeheartedly support that, but that would take me away from the farm too much because I have a retail operation. I can't be away from
Yeah.
it that much. That'd be 3 days a week where I'd have to leave. Local government is my passion. That's something I think is very important. And it's something I've done recently with, here's the landscape in my township. I'm one of 2 remaining farms in my township. So having a voice to speak to agricultural issues in my township is extremely powerful. And that's something I've been doing lately is whether it's writing letters or showing up to planning commission meetings in other townships lately. I've been trying to support other farms in other townships that are losing a lot of agriculture and
Yeah.
trying to support other farmers as they try and grow their agritourism operations in the face of a township where they may not be very ag friendly. So that's what I've been trying to do lately. I think it's very important.
Very important and not talked about enough, I would say. even just the understanding of that is something you could do and farm at the same time if you're involved at the local level. Important to share that, important for people on those boards to know things that they wouldn't know from a farm perspective. Now, we haven't talked a lot about Farm Bureau on this podcast. We just haven't had a chance to really dive deep into it, but I know it's important to so many farms and operations out there. And for you and I, honestly, when we met through a Farm Bureau program, like I mentioned. So if you want to dive in a little bit and talk about why you're involved in Farm Bureau, what you get to do, and maybe how that helps your operation.
My grandfather was a county president in Farm Bureau, but I still didn't know much about it. And when I was a young adult and I worked on the farm, and one day we were hosting a legislative breakfast. Our county Farm Bureau hosted an event to have breakfast and meet with elected officials at our farm. And we'd done that several times before, but I didn't really know what Farm Bureau was at the time. And I never really asked anybody and no one ever really told me. And our district representative at the time, or staff member from Michigan Farm Bureau, pulled me aside and said, "Hey, are you a Farm Bureau member?" And I said, "I don't know." And I was at the time. The business had been paying for my membership. And he said, "Hey, we've got a brewery tour that we're doing for a young farmer event." And I said, "Okay, that sounds great." And that one ask got me involved in Farm Bureau. So after that, someone said, "Hey, would you like to be a delegate at our state annual meeting?" I said, "I don't know what that means." And they explained it to me. And I said, "That sounds pretty interesting, And so really it starts with just a small ask. And basically, so what Farm Bureau membership means to me is advocacy for agriculture. And so having a unified voice to bring to elected officials and say, "Hey, this is what we as farmers need in order to continue to provide food." That Farm Bureau membership has allowed me to band with other farmers, and especially people who I'm, if I had only stayed in my little bubble of apple growers in West Michigan, I had never have met anyone like you. I'd never have met anyone that's in row crops or in sugar beets, or there's mint farmers in Michigan. There's all these, we have such a diverse state, and I would have never been exposed to it.
Thanks for sharing on that. We're wrapping up here. We've only got 2 more questions, but the first one I think is going to be really important, especially based on your history of innovation. What do you guys want to do next? Do you have any big plans for 2024? Where are you looking? What opportunities are there?
We've taken out a good number of apple trees. We're putting in some extra sweet cherries. Sweet cherries are a good moneymaker for us in the summer. So we're adding some extra. We're putting in some new U-pick varieties, leaning more into U-pick. Labor's a really difficult thing right now. Having the consumer come right to us and pick is a huge weight off of us if we can't find people to pick for us. But that's a big change. We got a new picking platform that we can tow behind a tractor and pick without having to call ladders. We're hoping to become more efficient in the way we pick too. Just trying to become more efficient and better.
Yeah, responding to external forces, it sounds like a little bit. Labor could be its own podcast. That could be its own dealio. This honestly could have been a whole series, but I do want to wrap things up, let you get back to your tree trimming for the winter, especially while the weather isn't too bad here. At least we're not under a foot of snow. But on our last question, the question we ask all our guests, we do want to hear, how do you keep it rural?
That comes from, even though I call myself a suburban farmer, we have customers that come to us and it's like they're visiting a farm, but they live 5 minutes away.
Yeah.
And so they have this feeling of they come to pick apples, they come to drink cider and taste wine, and they'll do a hayride. And they have this rural feeling just, 10 minutes from where they live. And I love to see the look on a kid's face as I drive a tractor with an apple bin on the loader on the front through the parking lot. That was one of my favorite things. His jaw dropped to the floor. Look, a tractor. And so that feeling of a portal to a rural world in a suburban area. It's such an exciting thing for us to do.
You're like distilling the essence of a farm in a sense, and a winery and a bakery too, and making them available. That's just about as rural as you can get, is preserving that culture and keeping the tradition alive and keeping things moving at the same time. All right, Allan, I do want to hear where people can find your farm if they ever want to reach out or learn more.
Our website is robinettes.com. Our Instagram is Robinette's Apple House, and that's German spelling on house, Haus, and Robinette's on Facebook.
Awesome. Keeping It Rural listeners, we'll catch you next time on our next episode.
It's not a party without you there. Follow our crazy on Facebook and Instagram, and be sure to check out all episodes and extras at keepinitruralgirls.com.
Until next time, keep it rural.
It's time to pour on the fire and call in the dogs. That's all, folks.